Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne. I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The New York State Board of Regents now requires private schools to prove they are meeting academic standards by teaching basic educational subjects like math and English. Hasidic schools are primarily the targeted schools for these new guidelines, and they could risk losing government funding if they fail to deliver. Joining me to discuss these guidelines is David Bloomfield, Professor of Education, Leadership, Law, and Policy at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to see you.
Now, can you first start off just by telling us a little bit more about the New York State Board of Regents? What are they all about and what is their purpose?
The New York State Board of Regents is a 17-member group of people appointed by the state legislature to be the board of directors for the state education department. They're the ones who get to approve these regulations that were just passed.
Okay. Now, they are requiring private schools to show proof that they are teaching basic educational subjects like math and English, but I'm really curious to know, are private schools guilty of skipping out on basic subjects like these?
Well, we don't really know because we haven't had those inspections that were supposed to be undertaken many years ago and just haven't taken place. So let's assume that almost all of these schools are teaching regular secular subjects. That's, after all, what a school is intended to do. But we're going to have to find out, and that is particularly regarding a small number of ultra-Orthodox Jewish yeshivas, which have had preliminary investigations and which have fallen short.
Now, I'm curious to know, Hasidic schools are primarily the targeted schools for these new guidelines. Prior to this, what freedoms did these private schools have in regard to their educational courses?
Well, they really haven't had any freedom in terms of the secular subjects. There's been a state law on the books for over a century that says all private schools, as well as public schools, have to have substantially equivalent secular programs. Now, certainly religious schools are free to have religious coursework many hours a day. And that's what Catholic schools do. That's what Muslim schools do. That's what ultra-Orthodox and all Jewish schools do. The problem is whether they're complying with state law regarding secular education.
Now, can you actually tell us what kind of inspired this move to kind of learn more about whether these schools are actually teaching these subjects?
In 2012, an organization was created called YAFED, Young Advocates for Fair Education, and these were graduates of the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas who felt that they hadn't received essentially any secular education in traditional subjects: English, math, social studies, the arts, science. And that's what they demanded of the state education department and Mayor Bill de Blasio, who was in charge of investigating these schools, to make sure that a legally compliant education was being provided.
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned that because I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I know Naftuli Moster, founder of the Young Advocates, was a part of the group of people, as well as other people in this community have been advocating for this change. Can you just explain a little bit, maybe what those people were experiencing that kind of made them want to see this shift?
When Naftali graduated from an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, he was hardly literate in English. He had never heard of a molecule. He had never heard of the United States Constitution. And he really was unable to write even a simple essay. And that is what raised his awareness of this common problem in several of these ultra-Orthodox Jewish schools, mostly in Brooklyn and upstate New York.
Wow, I'm so glad that you mentioned that because I had no idea to what extent a lot of these students were facing this. Now, can you just let us know, why do you think that, this has gone on for so long?
This has gone on so long because of the voting power of the ultra-Orthodox in the state and in the city. And so they basically got the politicians to look the other way while apparently not complying with the law. Again, we don't really know We need to have documentation. We need to have investigations to see whether children are getting the appropriate education that's required by law.
Now, if these schools fail to follow these requirements, they risk losing government funding. What does the government funding go towards?
The government funding goes towards multiple types of activities. There's supposed to be secular activities of these schools. We pay for transportation. We, the taxpayers, pay for security. We pay for textbooks. We pay for Title I, which is federal reading and math instruction. So millions of dollars. The New York Times said $1 billion over the course of 4 years in taxpayer money, federal, state, and local, goes to these ultra-Orthodox yeshivas. And we have to make sure that taxpayers are getting bang for the buck, as well as legal compliance apart from the government funding.
Now, if they lose this funding, what would that mean for, the students and the teachers who attend those schools? Like, how will this affect them specifically?
Well, these services wouldn't be paid for out of taxpayers' pockets because these wouldn't be considered schools. And in fact, parents who send their children to these schools would not be complying with the compulsory school law because they have to be sending their children to schools which have these types of subjects. So how the schools are going to handle this, let's just hope that they get into compliance. They see if they're not providing substantially equivalent secular instruction, that they're going to have to do that with competent teachers, which is another part of the new regulations. And then parents and the public will be assured that an appropriate education is coming out of these private schools, which are perfectly free to be teaching their religious dogma, their religious practices, their religious documents, as much as they would like.
Now, according to the New York Times, many members of the Hasidic community are opposed to this. Why do you think there is so much pushback?
Well, if the opposition is against the new regulations, I think people misunderstand the regulations. There's been a lot of misinformation promulgated by the private schools, not only the religious private schools, but by the independent private schools, that somehow this is the government going into the schools and micromanaging the curriculum, and, as I say, restricting the religious parts of the curriculum, and none of that is true. Nobody likes to be regulated. So I understand that the yeshivas, the other religious schools, the private schools, don't want to have to be accountable. But they need to be accountable because education is a public good. We are all served by a population that knows English, science, history, the arts, and we are all disserved by people who can't speak English, write English, know basic scientific information to evaluate what's going on out in the world, and then to vote in an informed manner and not simply take direction from their leadership.
Now, I understand that a lot of these schools weren't given a timeline of when they had to show or prove that they are teaching these basic subjects. Do you think this is the best course of action, or should there be a timeline or something so that they can prove that they're teaching these subjects?
There are many problems with these new regulations. I think that they're too weak. And one area, as you point out, that they're weak is in timelines. This is an urgent matter. There are children not getting educated in New York City at public expense. We have to make sure that the timelines are short and definite, and not given discretion and over much time for planning and checking and planning again. This could take years. A child could go through their entire school career without a secular education before the government gets around to even inspecting them under the new rules.
Now, do you know if there are any details on how the state plans on ensuring that these schools are following the new state rule, or do you have any ideas on what they could do to ensure that they're following the new state rule?
Well, what has to happen under these new regulations is that the local school districts within which these private schools operate have to be inspecting the schools. That's a documentary inspection. But there are also these, they're called pathways where a school could get automatic waivers from the requirements by simply being connected to a registered high school, by being connected to an accrediting organization. Uh, it's not really clear how many will be required to undergo individual inspections rather than coming under these pathway exceptions, which I don't think meet the requirements of the law. The law requires, in a detailed way, the study of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Holocaust, the Irish potato famine, the Underground Railroad. This is a matter of great need and detail, which these pathways don't necessarily cover.
Now, I know we focused on Hasidic schools, but will this apply to all religious and private schools?
Under the law, this has to apply to all schools. We can't carve out special targeting of religious schools as opposed to secular independent schools. We can't carve out an exception for Jewish schools as opposed to Catholic schools. So it's just a legal requirement that all of these schools have to be covered. They're covered by the state law passed by the legislature. So this is not administrative micromanagement. This is a matter that the New York State legislature a century ago and continuously has thought that it's important that all children learn to read and write English, to know science, to know history. This isn't a great ask, but sometimes it seems that it is.
All right, David, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.